Hi, I'm Julien Deneuville, and this is SEO in 2024 Additional Insights.
Julien, what's your additional insight for SEO in 2024?
My insight would be about using log files and analyzing how search engine robots crawl your website. I think it's quite overlooked and a very important and insightful source of data. I know there are people who are very keen on doing this and very advanced, but even for smaller websites, it's sometimes very important. So as some of our audience already probably have guessed, I come from France. I still live in France, in fact. We've been doing log files analysis in France for probably 15 to 20 years already. So people have quite a lot of experience. Even in France, in fact, you've got people with a lot of experience, especially on the enterprise SEO part of the business, but still on the rest of the SEO spectrum, it's probably a bit overlooked. What we tend to say is that it's useful for larger websites when you've got tens of thousands or millions of pages. And that's true. It's very important on such large websites to be monitoring your crawl and making sure that not too many strange things are happening. But even on smaller websites, it's probably a good idea to try and grab your log files every now and then and see what's happening, because you might have quite a lot of surprises, in fact.
So let's start at the very beginning and just ask you, what are log files and what is log file analysis?
Yeah, so basically the software hosting your website is called a web server, and it's registering every request that's been made to it. So basically, whenever a user or a robot comes to download a web page to display your browser, for example, it will have to request quite a lot of files, in fact. So the actual HTML file, but also images, JavaScript, etc. And all of this is registered into what we call log files. So basically, those are plain text files with several fields, let's say, that register every part of the traffic that's coming to the server. To be honest, nowadays it's a bit more complex with coming up CDNs, etc. So it might be a bit trickier than this, but it's always kind of the same logic. It's registering traffic that's coming to a website.
So assuming that you're not using a CDN then, how do you get access to your log files?
I would suggest the easiest way is to either ask IT or your web developer or host service, etc., to give them to you. Otherwise, it's probably not easy to tell this orally, but they are always stored in the same kind of places in your web server. And if you are using smaller hosting services, they often already provide those files in a specific place in your management accounts, let's say. The issue you might have is with some services. I'm thinking of a few ones, so I won't be pointing too many fingers, but some...
Or you can mention any software you want. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, some services like I think HubSpot or Shopify, for example, do not provide log files, sadly, at least to my knowledge. So yeah, you might be blocked sometimes from accessing those files, but it's mostly edge cases, and 90% of the time you can get those. And you also will find that in some places, so in some countries, it's in fact a legal requirement to store log files for at least a year. In some countries, in fact, if your host is telling you that they don't have your log files, they are out of the law.
So you mentioned earlier on that it can be a bit more challenging if you use a CDN to access all your log files. So what happens if you use something like Cloudflare? What would be the process then to make sure that you access all the log files you need?
Yeah, so if you are using a CDN, it will depend a lot on how it's configured. But basically, you can either have access to log files directly on your own web server, but it might not be the entirety of your traffic. And you also can get some information directly on your Cloudflare interface, for example. So what's completely feasible is to set up a daily export, for example, of your logs that are generated by the CDN. So it won't be exactly the same format as what you are maybe used to on a Apache or Nginx server.
And sorry for jumping in. If you have certain elements of your page that are delivered by a CDN and other elements delivered by your own web server, do you attempt to tie the log files together?
Yeah, so again, it's probably a bit of an edge case, but I think in this specific case, you probably will end up using the CDN files because most of the time it's what's registering the whole traffic. And yeah, in fact, that's what we use those for, is to cache traffic and make sure that our web servers are not getting too much requests. Again, it's very specific on how things are set up, and nowadays everybody has a different way of doing stuff like this. So I can't give so many generic answers on this. The best idea, I think, on this is to get help by your IT department or whatever you call it.
So what software do you use to analyze your log files?
I'd say nowadays we've got plenty of tools available on the market. I'm eager to use two French SEO tools, in fact, which are OnCrawl and Botify. Especially OnCrawl because I've been using mainly this tool for many years, and I know it's quite well now. So yeah, basically there are tons of other tools on the market nowadays. I'm always kind of coming back to those two ones because they are the probably most experienced ones, and also the ones with which I've got the most experience myself. So it's always easier to find your way around. But as those log files are in fact simple text files, you can also analyze those with any other solution. For example, back in the day, we did not have either Botify or OnCrawl, and we used our terminal or console on our computers to analyze this. Nowadays, if I was to do it by myself, I would probably use a Python script like a pandas data frame or something like this. So there are tons of solutions to.
I mean, I guess it depends on the size of the site as well, because if you're using OnCrawl or Botify, then you're probably using a cloud service, so you can probably crawl larger websites.
Yeah, in fact, you're bringing many important topics, so thanks for this. Yeah, as your website size and traffic grows, it's more and more important to get a proper software to analyze your data, just because by yourself you might have trouble handling that many data. And yeah, in that particular context, I think cloud services are the best options. And as you mentioned, those tools have also a crawler, so it's very interesting because you can compare what you see when you crawl your own website with what search engines would look for example. And in fact, that's where the core of log analysis is to understand whether the vision you've got of your own website and where you want users and bots to go is what's actually happening on your website.
So what discrepancies do you tend to see when you're comparing your own crawls with crawls that you see from search engines, and what do you do about those discrepancies?
Well, first of all, I would kind of take a step back, and the first issue you might face is the actual amount of data you get, because as we said, we've got CDNs, different servers, etc., and it's sometimes tricky to get the entire flux of data. So the first step I would take is to make sure that the amount of, for example, Googlebot hits that I get in a file is relevant regarding what I can see, for example, in Google Search Console. So it won't be the exact same numbers, of course, but if it's within, let's say, 2 to 5%, it's okay. If it's not the case, you've got a problem somewhere. So you have to dive a bit deeper and understand what's happening. So this would be really my first big advice, is to make sure that the files you are analyzing are realistic and are making sense.
So what would likely be the error here? Would there be more log files or crawl traffic that you're discovering through your log file analysis compared with traffic through Search Console, or the other way around? And what would typically be causing that issue?
So hopefully you've got the right amount of data the first time, and that's the case in most cases, in fact. What happens often is that you don't get enough data because probably you were not looking at the right server. Like we talked earlier about a CDN kind of caching traffic and not showing everything to the server. So if you are grabbing the log files from the server, you might not get the entire logs. What happens sometimes, of course, is the other way around. You've got more data in your log files than what you are supposed to find. And most of the case when this happens, it's because your web server is not configured as the right way, and you are registering like twice a single request, for example.
So what would be one or two examples of how log file analysis can help to direct SEO strategy?
I think one of the first key elements would be to see whether, especially Googlebot, because that's the one we are mostly focusing on, Googlebot is seeing errors on your website. So errors, I'm talking about anything that's not 200 HTTP response code. So either redirects, client errors, or server errors are errors. Redirects, it's mostly, most of the case, normal to get 301s, etc. But you have to make sure that your internal links on your website are pointing directly to the new URL, for example, if you change URLs, and not to a redirected one. So that's one of the classic mistakes that we can do. And then regarding other kind of errors, it's always important to try and fix those, and also to make sure that they don't end up being the vast majority of the crawl, let's say, especially server errors. So every error that's starting with a 5, like 5 or 3, etc. Whenever the rate of those errors is increasing, you might end up getting kind of de-indexed by Google and not showing up in the results. So this can be very bad for your traffic, of course. It's easy to recover if you are fast enough to fix the problem, but it's one of those topics where when you're working on larger websites, you have to be very very consistent on looking what's going on and making sure that there are no issues.
So how often should you be crawling your site and conducting log file analysis?
That's a good question. I think it's depending on the context, and we might have strategies of crawl that might be surprising sometimes. I'd say on the vast majority of websites, I'd recommend to have at least a monthly crawl. With or without log files analysis, you will still find many things if there are issues. And if there are not issues, it's still a good thing to just make sure that things are evolving the way you want them to evolve. And yeah, regarding log files, if you are working on a website that's larger than, let's say, 100,000 pages, I would recommend getting log file monitoring, as I say. So basically grabbing like daily files and putting those on a cloud-based software. If it's a smaller website, you probably can go around with just auditing your files every now and then. So maybe once a year, for example, it's probably enough.
So you've shared what SEO should be doing in 2024. Now let's talk about what SEO shouldn't be doing. So what's something that's seductive in terms of time, but ultimately counterproductive? What's something that SEO shouldn't be doing in 2024?
I'm quite sure it's not just about SEOs, but I think one of our major issues right now is being sometimes a bit too confident about what AI agents can provide. I mean, I'm totally pro using ChatGPT and other models like this to help us daily. In fact, I've been using some of those models for years now, especially on the coding part of my job. So yeah, it's very useful and it can help you get things done a lot faster. But you still have to make sure you are not too confident about what's going on with those. People might have heard about models hallucinating, for example, so basically inventing stuff or just putting words and numbers together because the sentence makes sense when you read it, but in fact, it might often end up not being actual reliable data, for example. There are workarounds that are being developed and that can help you get better reliable data or results on a larger scale. But if you do not take those additional steps and you want to use AI on larger scales, you probably will end up quite quickly with, for example, texts that making no real sense for people who know the actual topic, for example. So yes, this would be my main concern about SEO and our broader society, really, for the coming time.
Julien Deneuville is Senior SEO Manager at Turo. You can find him over at turo.com. Julien, thanks so much for adding your additional insight to SEO in 2024.
Thanks for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. You've been listening to an episode of SEO in 2024 Additional Insights, a Majestic series that complements the original SEO in 2024 podcast, video series and book. Find out more at SEOin2024.com.